This is Cremna. We're in the middle of the ancient city of Cremna, which, like Pisidian Antioch, was another Roman colony, but a much smaller one, or at least, although not a smaller city, but one with a smaller number of Roman colonists who presumably lived alongside and dominated the local people. Cremna is right in the middle of Pisidia. It's right in the heart of Pisidia. It's a very typical Pisidian site. It's on a very craggy hilltop, and in fact the name Cremna means something like craggy or cliffy. And on three sides the city is virtually impregnable. There are walls running along the tops of the cliffs, but they're hardly necessary given the steepness of the approach. And only on one side, which we'll come and have a look at a bit later, was it necessary to build a wall with defensive towers. The city itself starts probably in the 2nd century BC, the earliest buildings we have, so before the Roman colony was founded under the Emperor Augustus. And then, rather surprisingly, there are very few early Roman buildings, unlike Antioch, where there were major Roman buildings put in from the start of the colony. Here they seem to have been satisfied with using the existing buildings right up until the end of the 1st and the beginning of the 2nd century AD in the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian. And just behind me here are the remains of one of the central features of the site, the Forum and Basilica, which are Hadrianic in date, although they're built to a Roman-style ground plan with a forum and integrated basilica, a public meeting hall alongside it where public business, courts, decision-making, etc. could take place. But interestingly, along one of the sides of the forum, they set up a typical Pisidian dice oracle. And the person who dedicated the dice oracle, who paid for it to be put up, was one of the Roman colonists, because the inscription survives, which tells us that he did so. So this is another case where the Roman colonists came in, but they took over a local practice of telling oracles by throwing dice, a practice which we find all across southwest Asia Minor. The building is built to Roman design. It's slightly old-fashioned in decoration in that they use the Doric style of entablature, which was really very old-fashioned, old Greek style, more or less overtaken by imperial Corinthian style of building, which is much more flamboyant and full of detail. But they hang on to the old style for a long time in this part of the country. Immediately behind me, I'm not sure how much is visible in this shot, are some very highly decorated pieces which fell from a propylon, a monumental gateway with 3 entrances, which stood at the top of a stairway dividing an upper from a lower part of the central city area, an upper agora from a lower agora, if you like, rather as we find at Sagalassos, where the main buildings of the metropolis of Pisidia are arranged or stepped down on a series of terraces joined by monumental stairways. In this case, this stairway seems to have been put in and the propylon built under the Severan emperors, so at about 200 to 210 AD, and a large number of the pieces survive there, and theoretically it would be possible to reconstruct them. One could, with a lot of patience and expertise, work out exactly where each one went, and then with a lot of money you could have a go at rebuilding them. For my part, I'm quite happy to see them as a sort of romantic ruin rather than as a modern, as it were, shopping centre built in the middle of the city. the ruins tell their own story, that Cremna was obviously a successful city in the Roman period. There was a lot of money here. People could afford to put buildings up more splendid than most of the other cities of the region. In other words, Cremna became a big and important city, and those Roman colonists seem to have become sort of integrated into the landowning elite of the area. We worked here from 1985 to 1987, so immediately after finishing at Antioch we came to Cremna. There had been work on the site before. Jale Anan of Istanbul University, classical archaeologist, one of the leading classical archaeologists of the sort of pioneer generation really in Turkey, did what was described as a rescue excavation in a building which she interpreted as a library building. I'm inclined to think it was a bathhouse, although it also served, whatever its original purpose, it served as a sort of prestige display building where a whole group of very fine statues had been found and taken to Burdur Museum. Fortunately, they didn't disappear into the antiquities market, so they're part of the Burdur collection. And it was the find of those statues that drew Jale Anan's attention to the site, and she excavated the area where they had been found and found the statue bases on which they stood, which enabled her to identify the statues and reconstruct their original positions. So it's a nice piece of archaeology. That was 1971-72. The Istanbul team also cleared these steps on which I'm standing, but left the work at that point. So what we came back to do was to try to put all that into context and get a proper full plan of the city, and look at the other remains and then see how these two particular central highlights fitted into the overall picture. It was extremely hard work. It was very, very hot working up here in July. Temperatures in the high 30s, not much shade, all the water you had to bring up with you, and at the end of a 5 or 6 week season we were all pretty well dead, but still had about enough strength to come back the next year and finish it off. And we managed to do, I'm not sure that we've accounted for every building on the site of Cremna, but most of them by the end of 3 seasons. Apart from the public buildings, one of the things that attracted me to the site was that domestic housing is quite well preserved. We've got a grid layout of streets alongside a monumental colonnaded street with shops behind it, which runs westward from the city centre out towards the city walls, and then a whole quarter of domestic housing which we were able to plan, including a number of small churches which were built in later antiquity, because the site went on till the end of antiquity. And I think there are more churches, I think, that we've plotted on Cremna than on any other Pisidian city site. I think there are 8 or 9 churches in all, including the basilica, which at some date was converted into a sort of cathedral or a major city church. Right, I'm now sitting on the west wall, or just in front of the west wall of the city of Cremna. And behind me, I think you can see one of the towers, probably built in the 1st century BC, therefore one of the original defensive walls of the city. Now, most Pisidian cities had defensive walls, and so that's not particularly remarkable. In this case, the wall line across this most accessible part of the city contains 12 towers and runs for about 1 kilometre from the north to the south cliff. But by good fortune, Pisidian Cremna is one of the few cities of the region where we actually have some a historical account relating to its later history. And two sources tell us that there was a war that took place in this region in the 270s AD, so the latter part of the 3rd century AD, a war which appears to have been a sort of local uprising against Roman rule. So a large-scale regional rebellion, probably caused by the fact that the Roman Empire was no longer as secure as it used to be. There were threats, especially from the east, from the Persians. The Romans were no longer as capable of preserving the peace of the region, the security of the cities as they had been, and this gave rise to political disturbance and, in this case, to a major insurrection. One of the accounts tells us that the rebels, who were eventually defeated by the Romans, made their last stand at Cremna, and they held out in this city for a long period and were besieged here, and eventually their chief, a man called Lydius, was killed by an arrow bolt shot by a marksman from the Roman side, and the city capitulated after that. This story, which is told with a lot more colourful details, looks like has many of the sort of traditional features when you're talking about a siege of a city and warfare, and was often dismissed as being legend, fantasy, just invented story to add a bit of substance and colour to a more general account of the regional rebellion against Rome, until our second season, when our surveyor, Robin Fursden from Newcastle, who was walking all over this area doing the mapping, had heard me tell the story of the siege, and then came back to me one evening in the village and said, "Just tell me the details of that story again." And I told him. He said, "Well, I think I've found the siege for you." And what he'd found was this hill, this red earth hill in front of the city wall. And he said, "I think that's a siege mound. It's artificial, it's not natural. It's a different colour from the rest of the surroundings." And that this would have been the point at which the attacking troops brought their machinery, their artillery, their siege engines, or their assault troops as close as possible to the wall to cause the maximum possible damage, breach the walls, and get into the city. So the following day, the two of us walked across from Hajabar village, which is about a kilometre away, to the site, across the rough ground in between. And within about an hour, we had found, not everything, but everything fell into place. As we walked across in the village, we found that we were crossing not one, but two rough stone fortifications, which appear to have been the fortifications of the besiegers who made a camp there and may have been there for weeks or as long as months before they took the city. And if you look on the ridge opposite, you can see quite a lot of rubble stone, which in fact are the remains of those of the foremost of the easternmost of the siege walls, and there's another one further west. Inside the siege walls we found an inscription, a Latin inscription, which is a dedication to the Roman emperor who was ruling when the siege was made, and was obviously set up in the headquarters building of the besieging army by the provincial governor. So we actually had clear proof that these walls belonged to the siege. And then we came over the wall and found ourselves in the valley in front of the city and confronted by this large red earth mound, and it was obvious that our surveyor's explanation was entirely correct. This could only be a siege mound. In the valley below we found two or three vast stone balls cut into circular balls, which were used by the defenders, I think, to roll down the slope on the enemy, on the Romans, as it were, to try and stop them. Inside the city, we found much smaller artillery balls, about 15 centimetres across, which would have been the ammunition thrown by the artillery, which could have been placed as close as on the top of this mound, but also on the closest points on the opposite side of the valley, which, according to my calculations and what I've read, was just about within the effective range of heavy artillery of the late Roman type. So in other words, we could back up the story of the siege of Cremna with a really very full archaeological documentation of the siege and locate it exactly here. So on the one hand, it confirms the authenticity of the historical record in a splendid way, but also shows the real scale of this rebellion. We're not dealing with a few brigands in the mountains here. We're dealing with a very organised rebellious army that resisted Rome and took a major Roman military operation in the form of this siege to overcome it. And so that's the siege of Cremna, AD 278. We can put an exact date to it. And the moment at which Cremna, after 200 and more years, 300 years of Roman peace, and the security which enabled all the fine buildings to go up and people to spend their money on urban living in a Roman or Roman Greek style, went into reverse, and now security once more became a major issue, and the city was engulfed unexpectedly in warfare. It continues to be occupied throughout the rest of antiquity, so it wasn't the end of the city, but it was clearly a sort of epochal moment in Cremna's history. And when I published the site, I wrote the book about it with colleagues who worked here, and we called it An Ancient City in Peace and in War, because the whole second half of the book was dedicated to discussing the ramifications and interpretation of this siege.